who is the director of oral history and genealogy at the Atlanta History Center. Sue's passion is genealogy, and the other passion she has is oral history, and she's managed to get a job doing something that she loves, which I think is great. I met Sue several years ago through the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, the OLLI program, which Emory also sponsors, and have taken genealogy classes from her as well as worked with her on the Veterans History Project. Sue has been with the History Museum for quite some time and is at the Kennan Research Center. And she put together an exhibit called More Than Self, Living the Vietnam War, which was great. It was really good. And she's going to talk to us today about genealogy. So if you would please, if you have questions, put them in the chat, and I'll collect them and interrupt her every once in a while to give her the questions. Also, you should have gotten 4 attachments to an email that you got today, and they're her presentation, as well as some other interesting handouts that she's put together. So I guess that's all right now. Sue, welcome, and we're glad to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really glad to be here. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Make wild gestures at the camera if you cannot. Thank you for having me here today. What I thought I would do before we begin is talk a little bit about the handouts that you should have received. If you haven't received them, please be sure to let someone know or let me know. I'll make sure that my contact info is in the chat before we finish today. So there's a few handouts that you received, and I wanted to kind of show you what those look like just real briefly. So the first handout is the slide deck. So this is a PDF of the PowerPoint presentation today, so that you've got that available to you in case you'd like to view along with me as we go. The next handout that I wanted to mention is this little PDF that's a list of all of the websites that we're going to talk about today, and some extra resources that I hope you'll find helpful as you work on your family history. The third handout is a little brochure that we created here at the Atlanta History Center. It does not list everything that we have, but it lists the things that most of our patrons find most helpful when they're conducting family history research here at the Kennan Research Center. So there is that. And as John mentioned, my other passion is oral history, specifically veterans oral history. Our Veterans History Project contains about 800 interviews of veterans from World War II through the Global War on Terror. It's a pretty fabulous collection. About 2/3 of it is available online. I'm working to get the last little chunk up in the next few months. So this little brochure is just a little bit about the program and how to participate if you're interested. So if you are a veteran or love a veteran or know a veteran, I hope that you'll reach out to me that way. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. And I'll tell you, I'm adjusting, because you have to the virtual thing. But boy, I really miss meeting in person, because one of the questions that I like to ask is what kind of familiarity you have with genealogy. Typically, when I do public programs in person, I find that it's a pretty nice bell curve. You get quite a few people in the middle that have a little bit of experience, and you've got a few on each end that are either very experienced or have very little experience. So what I want to do today is just give you a few teasers. There's no way that I can cover everything or even touch on everything in a 1-hour presentation, but my hope is that over the course of this presentation, I'll share with you at least one little nugget that you can take away with you to help you to get started. And I am happy to serve as a resource for you here at the History Center. So I hope you'll feel free to contact me if you've got further questions about what we talk about today. So this is Life in the Past Lane, beginning genealogy. Don't you love this pedigree chart? Don't we wish all of our pedigree charts were as beautiful as this one? What we're going to try to do today, this is kind of our plan of attack. So we're going to start out talking a little bit about how to begin doing your family history research. we're going to talk a very little bit about how to organize it. I didn't used to talk much about organization in my beginning genealogy programs, but I just feel like if you can avoid my pitfalls and not do what I did, you'll be in better shape. So the more organized that you can stay as you go through this process, the better off you're going to be. So I'm going to share just a few things for you to think about in terms of organizing the material that you're going to be collecting. And then we're going to talk about low-hanging fruit, some of the records that are really easy to find, really easy to work with, and we'll talk kind of about how to find them and how to use them. We'll talk a little bit about caring for family records. I'll take off my genealogy hat and put on my archivist hat and talk a little bit about some of the things that you need to be aware of if you're one of the lucky ones who has original documents or original photos that have been handed down through your family. And then finally, if there's any time left over at the end, and I'm going to try to keep a real close eye on the time, I'm happy to demonstrate some of the websites that we'll talk about and some of the things that we'll go over. So we'll see how things go. I do want to make sure we allow plenty of time for questions throughout the program. So to go ahead and get started, how do you begin? Well, it's pretty easy. You're going to start with you. You're going to write down or record in some of the things we're going to talk about to organize your research, everything that you already know or think that you know about your family. It really needs to start with you. Every time I do a program, I run across somebody who has a situation like this where they'll say, I'm related to Pocahontas or whatever, and they want to start at Pocahontas and then prove the relationship to them. Most of the time doesn't work that way. You want to start with you and go back one generation at a time to flesh out your family tree. So you're going to start with you. And the next thing you're going to do after you've kind of plumbed your own mind and your own memory, you want to kind of go through your home or your office or both and look for letters or documents or books or even heirlooms that might shed some light on your family history. And these are things that you're going to analyze. And we're going to talk a lot about that as we go through the program today. So for example, this is a family Bible. This is not my family Bible. It belongs to a good friend of mine, but it's a great way to sort of illustrate these kinds of things that you might have laying around your house. So I know it's a little harder to see in that other slide, so I've blown it up here a little bit for you. If we were all together, I would be asking you these questions and we would have a nice dialogue, but that's a little hard to do in a virtual setting. So I'm just going to sort of go over the questions and answer them and have you be thinking at the same time. So hopefully you'll notice that there's some things that immediately stick out to you as you look at this document. Number one, you've got 4 different handwriting, at least 4. You've got this bunch, and I hope you can see my mouse here. You've got this bunch up here that look like they were written by one person. You got this bunch in here that look like they were written by someone else. And then this one down here, another hand, and this one down here. So these were not done all at the same time. If you look on the right-hand side of the page, you can see the first date in here is 1878, but later on down the page, you've got an 1862 date. So what does that tell you? It tells you that these dates were not written in at the time that they happened because they're out of sequence. So things like that you're going to look at. You're going to be critical as you analyze these sources that you come across to make sure that they're useful to you and that they're credible sources to be able to use. The other thing that you always want to do with family Bibles is you want to look at the publishing date. So for example, for this particular Bible, if it was published in 1925, what would that tell you? It would tell you that every date in here happened long after the event, that whoever entered those dates, they did it long after the event was over with. But if the Bible was published in 1859, then, there's a possibility that those dates happened a little closer to the time period. So going through your closets and your drawers and things like that, trying to drum up as much information as you can about your family, and you'd be surprised. You can glean genealogical information from a wide variety of sources, work records, educational records, letters, correspondence, photographs, and like I said, family heirlooms. If you've got a watch in your jewelry box and it's got an inscription on the back, that can provide some information. So you want to start with those things, start at home and start going through the things that you have accessible to you now. And then your next step is going to be to continue with what your relatives know. So you're going to want to reach out and talk with immediate family. And for those of you that we're all of a certain age, I guess here, it's safe for me to say that, don't wait. You just don't want to wait. Most of us will agree that we really wish we'd asked the right questions a long time ago before we started losing people. So you do want to talk with your immediate family, and again, write down the things that you find out and make sure that you keep track of who said that and when you had that conversation. You can write or email or telephone extended family members. You may want to think about conducting oral history interviews with older family members. And again, this is something you don't want to wait on. Again, this is a beginning program, and we've got a limited amount of time, so I can't go into a lot of detail, but feel free to reach out to me if you don't know how to do that. There's a lot of great sources that I can point you to that are widely available on how to do that properly. So if you are able, if you have family members who will agree to be interviewed, you do want to record it if you can, either audio or video, whichever kind of works for you, but you always want to be sure that you have your interviewee's permission, explicit permission to record the interview. And you want to make sure that they know what you intend to do with it. That's just an oral history basic. Cite your sources as you go. There's nothing more frustrating than having to reinvent the wheel, to look at something and say, you know, why did I think that? Why did I write this down? I don't have any idea where I got this. So make sure that you're making a record of the information that you find, where you got it and when you got it, so that you can find it again if you need it. The citation format is not nearly as important as just being able to find it, to have a breadcrumb trail so that you can get back to it if you need to. And then you do want to keep your research as organized as you possibly can and make sure that you back it up. We've all had cases where we've lost a hard drive or lost an external drive or lost data in some way, shape, or form, and you do not want to do that. You want to make sure that it's safely backed up and safely backed up in multiple places. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got was someone who told me to get 2 external hard drives, keep one at home and one at work, or if you're not working any longer, one in a safe deposit box or one with a family member. And then you can back up your data and just swap the 2. So every couple of months you swap the drives out and you make a fresh update. And that way you've got 2 backups and 2 backups in 2 separate geographical locations. So now I wanted to mention just a little bit about organization, how to kind of stay organized. I've always loved this little Kathy cartoon because this is me. You know, you start one organization project and one leads to another and you find yourself overwhelmed. And so it can be a struggle. And I've been doing this for 50 years, over 50 years. And I can tell you, I still struggle with organizing my research. So don't get overwhelmed. It happens to everybody. And it's something that you can do. I promise that you can do it. So some of the ways for you to organize your research would be to use paper forms. And there's nothing wrong with using paper forms. A lot of people prefer that. These are examples of pedigree charts and family group sheets. They're perfectly fine. They have disadvantages in that they're a little tougher to share. They're a little bulkier. They take up a little bit more space. But if you're comfortable using paper records, you can certainly do that. The other option would be to use web-based platforms like Family Search and Ancestry. Those have advantages and disadvantages too, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the presentation, but that's a way for you to build your tree. And it's a good way to collaborate with others who might share your ancestry. It's a great way to find those elusive cousins that you didn't know that you had. The one caution that I would say about using online-based websites to do this is please make sure that you've backed up your data on your home computer or in paper versions. So, you know, heaven forbid, if anything should happen to Ancestry, what's going to happen to all your carefully cited research and all those records that you clipped and attached to your ancestors? What's going to happen to those if something happens to Ancestry, or if your financial picture changes and you can no longer afford a subscription? Those are things that you want to think about. With websites like Family Search that have a little different model, their model is to collaborate. So there are no private trees on Family Search. Trees are open to everybody, which means that other people can play around with your ancestors. And I've had that happen. I've had people delete entire lines of my ancestry. I was able to bring those back fairly easily because I kept good records at home. So the final thing I wanted to talk about in terms of organization is software. There's a number of genealogy programs that are out there, software programs that are out there. And in your handout with additional resources, there's a little website, and there's other websites as well that will kind of help you to evaluate those. They'll review them and kind of compare the features. They're not expensive at all. I'm going to take off all my hats right now, and this is just Sue talking. I use Roots Magic for me, only because it's very similar to a free program that I used to use that's no longer available. So I like the interface, it's familiar to me. And I have found over the years that their support is really pretty good. So I use Roots Magic, but I know plenty of people who use Family Tree Maker, who use other Legacy. There's all kinds of software out there. Many of them will allow you to get a trial version and play around with it a little bit. So just be thinking about that. You're going to work awfully hard at this, and you're not going to want to lose your work. So you need to make sure that you're organizing it and that you're backing it up carefully. Any questions? John, do I have any questions up to that point?
None so far, Sue.
Not so far. Okay, good. So a few things to consider as we get to this point in the process. You want to think about your comfort level with technology. How comfortable are you working with databases and working with websites? You know, that can drive some of these decisions that you're going to make. How much space do you have? If you like paper files, that's great, but do you have plenty of room and a filing cabinet or a place to organize them? You want to think about security. How secure is your research? Again, you know, do you have this backed up at home? Make sure that you're not depending on a website to store all of the research that you're going to do. So be thinking about security. Be thinking about your budget. You know, we all have limited discretionary funds, and you want to get the most bang from your genealogy buck. You know, maybe the Ancestry World Edition is too expensive for you, but maybe you can go in together with a child and split the cost. You know, there's a lot of ways to skin that cat. So be thinking about your budget. Be thinking about sharing and collaborating. It is tough to collaborate when all of your records are paper-based. You can have your relatives come over and poke through your filing cabinet, but that can be a little bit more complicated. So do be thinking about how easy it's going to be to share with your family members and to consult with other family members about the research that you're doing. Is it sustainable? Are you going to use it? That's one thing that I have really learned over the years. I attended a conference a number of years ago, and they were selling, a vendor there was selling this amazing organizational system, and it had to do with color coding your lines, your female lines and your male lines, and it was file folders, and it appealed to the Kathy in me. You know, I was going to organize all my stuff. It was going to be beautiful. I was going to have these gorgeous files, right? Well, it sat in the back of my closet for about 3 years, and then I finally gave it away to a teacher because at least it was file folders and labels that could be reused. I was never going to do that. So you need to make sure that you find a way to organize that fits with the way you think, that fits with the way you do things. Citation, making sure you can cite your sources again. And being able to produce reports and pedigree charts and research logs is kind of a cool part of doing family history. If you've been on the web, you know, there's beautiful pedigree charts that you can print out and put on your office wall. And those are things that software can do for you. So that's something that you might maybe want to think about. You know, how well is this method that I'm using going to assist me and do some of the heavy lifting in terms of the research that I'm doing. Okay, so now we're going to talk about low-hanging fruit. So here's where we're going to kind of get into the fun stuff. Most people in life leave a paper trail of some kind or another, and your job is really just to follow it. So again, what you're going to do is start with you and work your way backward. First your parents, then your grandparents, then your great-grandparents, and so on and so forth. So apologies in advance for making this very personal. I just don't know how else to teach this without showing you kind of an example. And so as an example, I'm going to use my dad. My dad's wonky family. I love my dad's wonky family, but boy, are they wonky. And my reason for using them here is kind of to demonstrate to you all that if I can do this with my dad's wonky family, you can do it with your wonky families too. I promise that you can. So this is a picture that was taken when my dad was a baby. This is my dad right there. My dad's name was Arthur Jackson Hardy Jr. His father's name was supposedly Jackson Hardy. His mother's name was Nettie Kirby. His mother was married previously, and this is Sydney. This is a child from my grandmother's previous marriage. My grandmother died when my dad was about 5, and my grandfather kind of bounced around a little bit. He married again. The grandmother that I knew my growing up years, she was wonderful. He married again very late in life, married a 3rd time very late in life. But the interesting thing about my grandpa Jackson Hardy is a completely fictitious name. I don't know where he got it. I don't know why he chose it. He pulled it completely out of a hat. My dad told me my dad wouldn't talk a whole lot about his dad. He wouldn't talk a whole lot about his childhood. I know that he went through a few foster homes after his mother died. I know it was kind of a difficult childhood. And he and his dad had kind of a complicated relationship. There was a lot of love there, but it was a complicated relationship. And all my dad would tell me was that my grandfather's original last name was Bauer. That's all he knew. He didn't know his dad's first name. He just knew that the family name was Bauer, B-O-W-E-R. So way back in the 70s, back before the earth cooled, long before there was computers to use, I wanted to know something about Jackson. My dad told me that he died the year before I was born and that he died in California. So I wrote to the state of California and said, I got this man, Jackson Hardy. He died in 1955. Is there a death certificate? Can you provide me with that? And lo and behold, they did. So here is the death record. And I'm going to see if I can make a little pointer here. Hopefully you can see that. So this was the death record that I got from the state of California. So here's where the rubber meets the road. Here's what you want to do with every record that you find. You want to ask yourself, who created this record? So this record was created in tandem. It was ordered by the state of California. State of California required that vital records be made. And it was created by the doctor, that's his part in here, the doctor who filled out the death certificate, and the hospital. So it's a great record. You see all kinds of amazing information, but you want to ask yourself, who provided that information? So this top part here that says decedent personal data, who provided that? It wasn't my grandfather, he was dead, right? So you want to ask yourself that, who provided this information? In this particular case, the informant, which is right here, was Juanita Hardy. And if you look at the field right above it, name of present spouse, Juanita Hardy. So his wife at the time of his death is the one who provided all of this biographical information. Now, he had only been married to her. I found this out later. He had only been married to her for 3 years. So how reliable do you suppose Juanita's information is? That's a question that you want to begin to ask yourself. She put down his date of birth here. She said what his occupation was. She said who his father was and who his mother was and where they were born. She provided the fact that he had served as a veteran. So all of this information up here is suspect. The only information on this death record that you can be reasonably sure is accurate is the information that's filled out by the doctor. And there could even be errors there, you never know. So whatever the doctor said, and then hopefully whatever the funeral home information is here, he was buried at Forest Lawn. So looking at this document now, think of all the records that I can now go for. I've got a single death certificate. With the information on this death certificate now, I can look for his birth record. I can look for his parents' records, where they lived, census records and such. I can look for military records because he served in World War I. I can look for Social Security records because he's got a Social Security number. And I can go to funeral records, funeral home records, and cemetery records. So this one record has opened up a Pandora's box, but a good Pandora's box of potentially great information about my grandfather. So that's what I did. Starting with this death date right here, I thought, okay, he was born, she says he was born in New York in 1894. I'm going to write to New York State and see what they have. So I did. I wrote to New York State. I said, I don't know this man's name, but I know his last name was Bauer. At least I'm pretty confident his last name was Bauer. And he was born on March 15th. What do you have? So they came back with the birth record. And take a look at this. Again, you want to think about this record. Who created this record and why? So this was a certificate of birth in Brooklyn. So the borough of Brooklyn, Kings County, wanted to know this information for the state of New York. But who filled out all this information? Well, it was probably the doctor, but based on the information given by the mother, and in this case, the father. So if you look through this record, the first thing that leaped out at me, of course, was this right here, because I never knew that. So his birth name was Arthur Heft Bauer. As it turns out, Juanita Hardy was pretty darn correct. In fact, she was absolutely correct. He was born on March 15th, 1894. He was born to Dorothea Bauer, whose maiden name was Dorothea Heft, and his father's name was William, and now I've got a middle name, William Bridgart Bauer. It's got the place of birth, which is 69 South 8th Street, and then it lists the mother's residence, which is 69 South 8th Street. So he was born at home. Another piece that I found very interesting on this record is it lists the number of children that she has given birth to, which was 5, right? So he's the 5th birth. So that tells me there's at least 4 siblings. In 1894, he had 4 siblings. His father's occupation is listed here. So again, this was a gold mine of information. And I started out literally with, we don't know what his first name is. His last name is Bauer, and he died in 1955. And now look at the places that I can go. And it's true, it has opened up a vast amount of information. You'd be amazed at the info that I've gathered on my grandfather's family that I knew absolutely nothing about at the start. Okay. So after death records and birth records, death records are usually the easiest to get into in terms of vital records. Birth records can be a little more complicated because there's privacy issues, but obviously this is a birth that happened more than 100 years ago, so there's usually no problem accessing those. The next set of low-hanging fruit records that I would recommend are census records. Now, I know you can't see that. I promise I'm going to blow it up here in a minute. This is the 1900 federal census in New York. These are widely available. Multiple websites have access to these. They're very easy to find. And here is my William Bridgart Bauer family in Brooklyn in 1900. So I'm going to blow this up for you. And I know it might still be a little tough to see. Hopefully you can use your little PDF of the presentation though. A lot of people tend to look at census records and they'll look at the name and they'll look at the dates of birth and they stop there. Don't do that. You want to go through every single column across this census heading and gather as much information as you possibly can on your ancestors. And I always recommend that you gather a census record for every census year in which your ancestor was alive. So my grandfather was born in 1894, which means I'm going to be looking for the 1900, 1910, 1920, 1930, and 1940. And when the 1950 census is released next year, because there's a 72-year privacy thing on that, when that 1950 census is released, I'm going to want to look at that one too. The 1900 census is particularly helpful for a couple of reasons. So let me show you my folks here. There's my William B. Bauer, and it says here that he is the head of household. Over here it has the street number 69, and you couldn't see it on the other frame, I know, but South 8th Street was written along this left-hand column. So I know they were living at 69 South 8th Street. It tells me his birth month and his birth year. It tells me how old he is at the time. It tells me how many years he's been married. And then for his wife, Dorothea, this would be Dorothea Heftbauer. For his wife, it asks, how many children have you given birth to? 7. How many children are still living? 4. So at this point, she had already lost 3 children. The other thing you want to look at is all of the folks that are listed in that family household. And if you look down here at the bottom, you can see that John Heft is listed there. The census taker lists him as a father, but he's not a father to William Bauer, is he? He's a father-in-law. So remember that census takers can be harried and they can put incorrect information there too. But again, it's a place for you to begin looking. So this would be Dorothea's father, who was living in their household in 1900. And take a look over here. This is citizenship information. It asks him when he came to this country, which was 1840. It asks him if he is a citizen. Excuse me. It asks him how long he's been in this country. It says 60 years. And then the final column is, are you a citizen? And it says NA in that column, which stands for naturalized. So this tells me that my great-grandfather immigrated in 1860, and probably from Germany, because that it lists his place of birth. So he immigrated from Germany in 1840, has been in the country for 60 years, and he is naturalized. So now I can start looking for birth records. Good luck looking for Germany when you've got this much info, but again, that's for later presentations. But I can be looking for naturalization info because this gives me some dates to work with. So census records can be hugely helpful in doing your family history research. The next low-hanging fruit that I wanted to talk about real quickly are newspapers. And a lot of folks tend to think that newspapers are only useful for obituaries. Well, not really. They can be far more useful than that. Obituaries tended to come to the fore in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Prior to that, any earlier than that, you don't often find them unless the person was very prominent in the community or unless the death was particularly gruesome or interesting. That's just the way human nature is. But newspapers can be hugely helpful because during those time periods, they wanted to sell papers. They do today, but we get so much of our info online now. Back in that day, they wanted to sell paper newspapers. And so there was a big motivation to print things that would be of interest to people in the local community. So you find these wonderful accounts, particularly in towns that have a single employer that was important, like a mill town or a factory town. I don't have the name of this newspaper right here, but my guess is it was a Texas paper. The railroad was a big employer, and my grandfather was working on the railroad at the time. So this is a little clip that my dad kept for all of his life that just says, you know, J. Hardy and family were called to Denver to attend the bedside of Mrs. Hardy's sister who died of tuberculosis. This was in 1921. My grandmother died of tuberculosis 6 years later. It's entirely possible that she contracted it while she was visiting her sister when her sister was dying. So newspapers can be hugely helpful. This is another clipping that I found in my dad's papers. And this one is a little more tragic. I'll come back to lots of tragedy in this family. So this was my grandfather's sister who went to work on Fifth Avenue on the 25th floor of a building, climbed out, opened up the ventilating panel, climbed out and jumped to her death. The article says that she left a note for several of her siblings and for her doctor at the time. So this is a tragic event, but in this newspaper article, it provides me with some interesting information. It says these letters were addressed to Miss Bauer's brother, William. So that's my William Bridgart Bauer, but also to her sister, Mrs. F. Gautreaux in Brooklyn. So Mrs. F. Gautreaux would have been a Bauer to begin with, but that tells me her married name, which is also a difficult piece of info to connect sometimes when you're doing family history. It's misspelled in this article, but I was able to find a lot of information about her because this article told me the name of the person that she married, so I could follow her forward in time. When you're working with newspapers, though, just remember, you can't believe everything you read. So this is a social column article from the Palm Springs, California newspaper. Major Jack Hardy marries prominent Eastern socialite. So this is my dad and my mom. This is the notification of their marriage back in Maryland. But the newspaper says the bride, who spent much of her life in China and the Philippines, where her father, blah, blah, blah. My mother had never been to China. She'd never been to the Philippines. She'd never left the country. There is no such thing as a North Carolina girls' school. She graduated from school in Virginia. So you always want to take what you read with a grain of salt. My guess is that my dad's adoptive mother probably provided this info to the newspaper, and she kind of wanted to jazz it up just a little bit. So making my mother a world traveler just sounded a little bit more interesting. So that's kind of how that happened. So that's a little bit about newspapers. They're easy to find, very easy to find. And there are so many of them that are digitized now and available online. You can really get lost in newspapers. So just remember, it's not all about the obituary. There's a lot more out there for you to be looking for. Cemetery records is another place that you can go. And for this slide, I wanted to make sure that I said, always look for original documents. Indexes are a poor way to do research. You'll see a lot of indexes which just provide a person's name and a little bit of information. Go to the original document whenever you can. It's always the best. And then make sure you review those files from time to time. I know it sounds silly, but I tell people I'm convinced that genealogical information multiplies in the night when you're not looking. Because I had this cemetery record. We went to New York on a field trip, a dead people field trip a number of years ago. And I found the cemetery where my grandfather's family were buried. And I could tell that there were names on the headstones that I couldn't read. So I went to the cemetery office and said, do you have interment records? They said, absolutely, $35. We'll send it to you as soon as we can get it. So I did, and they did. And they sent me this little interment record, and it's heartbreaking. If you look down through here, you can see little male child Cornelius Heft. He only lived for 6 hours. There may not be a birth record for Cornelius. This may be the only record, that there is that he actually exists. His name is not on the headstone, or if it is, it was worn away. So cemetery records can be hugely helpful. But I looked at this document. You can see I've made notes over here at the side. I must have looked at this 400 times. On the 401st time, I happened to notice this. This is William B. Bower, William Bridgart Bower. This is my great-grandfather, okay? He was 80 years old when he died. He's buried in that plot in Brooklyn. But it says here, place of death, Suffolk County, New York. So I started wondering, what was he doing in Suffolk County, New York? That, combined with a World War I draft registration card of my grandfather's that said he was responsible for more than half of his mother's support, really got me wondering. So I started looking more carefully at census records. And as it happens, William Bridgart Bower spent the last 30 years of his life in a mental institution in New York. And that's something that I probably wouldn't have picked up on had I not looked a little bit more closely at some of these other records. You don't normally look at the person you're responsible for on a World War I draft card. Usually you're looking for the military member, but I happened to notice that on the card and thought, great-grandpa was alive then. Why would grandpa have been taking care of his mother when his dad was still alive? Well, that's why. His dad had been committed. And that's raised a whole nother, I say this with all the love and respect, insanity doesn't run in my dad's family, it gallops. There's been some really interesting and touching and heartbreaking things that I found out there. Lots of reasons, I think, why my grandfather chose to change his name and start a new life on the West Coast. So cemetery records, definitely helpful if you can find them. So quick little talk about where to find originals, where to find these records. They're going to be in a wide variety of places, and you need to think very broadly, but you also need to think very locally. You want to look at vital records offices for sure if you're looking for birth, marriage, and death records, but you also want to be looking at archives and libraries in the localities where your ancestors lived. You want to also be thinking about maybe joining the local historical or genealogical society in the counties where your ancestors lived. In this country, most records of genealogical value are kept at the county level. So be thinking on that very local level. Historical societies can be another excellent source of information. The internet can be hugely helpful. And we'll talk more about that in just a sec. But you kind of want to be thinking about who created the record and why. So if I'm looking for railroad records, my grandfather worked on the railroad. If I'm looking for railroad employment records, well, railroads are typically a federal thing. I'm probably going to look at the National Archives. And by the way, we have the southeastern region right down the road in Morrow, which shares a parking lot with the Georgia Archives. So if I'm looking, if I've got a Confederate, an ancestor who served in the Confederate Army from Georgia, I'm not going to look federally because the Confederacy was not federal. The Confederacy was state deal. So I'd be looking for the Georgia Archives for that. And if I had an ancestor who lived in Atlanta, I want to maybe look for some city directories in 1859 and see what street he lived on, I would look at the Atlanta History Center. Atlanta History, collecting for Metro Atlanta, that would be a logical place to go. So thinking about who created it and why will kind of help you to know the right place to go. Quick comment about the internet. So much of what you find on the web is total garbage. So please be careful. I love Find a Grave. It's one of my very favorite websites. It's a cemetery survey website with photos of headstones. It's wonderful, but they've decided to try to be helpful. They're going to put calculated relationships on the memorial pages and say, you know, John Smith, you know, he's buried here, and obviously he must be Fred Smith and Rita Smith's son. No, many times not. There's so much bad information on the web. Family Search for original records is a fabulous source of information. But if you're looking at the trees, you want to take everything you see with a grain of salt. Same with Ancestry. Trees, take it all with a grain of salt. The original records they provide access to are fabulous, but anything that's user submitted, you just want to be very critical, and don't believe anything until you see credible sources attached to it, okay? And another kind of quick note, you know, all of us sitting here in this presentation could spend the rest of our lives and never run out of things to find on the web. But having said that, still, the vast majority of genealogical records are still not online and available only in archives and libraries and repositories. So just kind of keep that in mind. The web is great, but at some point in your journey, you're going to have to go sit in the library and curl up with some old dusty books. It's just kind of the way it goes. Quick word about, yes, go right ahead.
I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
One is, is there any free genealogical software which you recommend?
I don't know of anything that's free. Websites like Family Search, you can certainly build a tree on Family Search for free, but you know, again, it's not something that you can keep on your computer and make sure that it's protected. I want to say that I paid $29 for Roots Magic, and it's a one-time, you know, you pay it once and it's yours forever, and the updates are free. Software updates for the version that you buy are free. So it's not too expensive. And again, you know, you can certainly share, you know, go in with a family member on some of these things to bring the cost down a little bit.
Okay. And if you have an Ancestry membership and are building your tree on Ancestry, is there a software piece that you can get which would replicate that and that you'd have on your computer if Ancestry?
There are a number, good question. There are a number of software programs that play very nicely with Ancestry. And that's another one of the reasons why I like Roots Magic. Again, I promise they didn't pay me anything to say that. That's just me. I like Roots Magic. A lot of people don't. You know, you got to find what works for you. But that is one thing I like about Ancestry, is that it plays very nicely with both with both Ancestry and Family Search. So you can sync your tree with Ancestry. You can download your tree from Ancestry into Roots Magic, but there are other software programs that will do that too.
Good, thanks. Um, if a person is looking for information for relatives coming through Ellis Island, are there ship's records for ancestors traveling by boat to the U.S. in the 1910s or so?
Yes. Many of them are available through Ancestry. Ancestry has pretty much got the hookup with the National Archives. National Archives has essentially opened their doors and said, you know, digitize it. Whatever you want to digitize, you're welcome to do it. There's a lot of those records available. There also are great records available on both Ellis Island and Castle Garden. Castle Garden was the earlier port of entry. Ellis Island's kind of cool though, because they've got digital versions of the records. Castle Garden does not, or at least they didn't the last time I went on that website. But Ellis Island is a free website. You can get in there for free. If you want to buy pictures of the ships your ancestors came, you know, that kind of thing, there's a charge. But you can get in there and look at their records for free.
Thanks. The last question I've got so far is, can you provide a list of recommended resources after the presentation? And yes, those are in one of the handouts that you found attached to the email that you got this morning.
Yeah. Okay, we good?
One more question that just popped up.
Sure.
What about Mormon databases?
I'm sorry?
What about databases for the Mormon Church?
Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that is Family Search. Members of the church were heavily involved in the early days of Ancestry, but Ancestry is a for-profit site now. The LDS Church manages Family Search for free. You have to register for the website, but nobody will ever contact you. They don't want that. What they're looking for in a registration is just to be able to contact somebody, again, in case there's a question. It's a safe way to collaborate with others because you don't have to share your email address with people. You can communicate via Family Search. Family Search is phenomenal. I can't say enough about both Ancestry and Family Search. They're both amazing. And records are being put up every single day. The last conference I went to, I was told that they had 132 camera crews scattered all over the world. This is Family Search now, digitizing records all over the world. And they put up somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 million new images every single day. So if you don't find Uncle John on Family Search today, doesn't mean you won't find him next week. And that's the same with Ancestry. New records are always being added.
Thank you. Also, Sue, would you talk a little bit about if you decide to build your tree on Family Search? Those records they can't be made private. And talk a little bit about private trees versus.
Yes, on Ancestry, you can make your tree private or you can choose to make it public. You can invite other family members to have either viewing privileges and or editing privileges. Ancestry, you've got a full array of privacy settings. You can do pretty much anything you want to do with your tree. It's your tree. And as long as you have a subscription account, you can't use the library edition of Ancestry to build a tree. You have to pay for it. But you can use the library edition to get into the records. You can search records with the library edition. You just can't build a tree. For Family Search, the idea is they want folks to collaborate. They don't want 1 million different trees. They want a single tree that 1 million people collaborate on. It's a great idea, but you can imagine there can be issues with it. So my best advice, if you're going to work with Family Search on your tree, there's a button with a star that you can click on your individual person, on each person in your tree, that says watch. And if you click on that watch button in your settings, you can tell Family Search, I want to be notified anytime anybody touches this person. And they'll do that. They'll send you a weekly email with a list of all the people who've been altered or modified in your tree, as long as you've clicked that watch button. And beyond that, I would just make sure that you keep your research on your computer. Use Family Search to build your tree, to collaborate with cousins, and to, be a good global citizen. But keep your research on your home computer so that it's not lost. Does that help?
Thank you. Yep, thanks.
Okay. Are we good?
We are good to go.
Okay, just a couple things. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. If you are lucky enough to have original records in your possession, here's a couple of suggestions that I just want to make sure you're aware of. Make sure you use high quality acid-free containers. Archival safe is not like the Food and Drug Administration, where you can make a claim and they have to substantiate it. Anybody can say something's archival safe. I've bought archival safe stuff at Office Depot, brought it back here and run a pH pen over it, and it's not. So be careful what you purchase to put your original materials in. Make sure that the containers that you buy fit them. Don't roll things up and fold things up. That's not good for them. Don't store newspapers with your original photographs and documents. Newspapers are death. They are the most highly acidic thing you can have in your collection. Don't store them in the same folders as your precious things. Keep them away from light, heat, and humidity. You don't want them in your basement. You don't want them in your attic. And don't take them away from home. Not that anybody is going to want to steal your pictures of great-great-great-grandpa Joe, but you just wouldn't want to lose them. Don't take these things away from home. Make sure you keep them at home. Take scans away with you. And at this point, I always put this one in because usually at this point, everybody's like, oh my gosh, can she just stop talking? And besides that, Osborne is a family name. So I always get a kick out of this. Mr. Osborne, my brain is full. Just about done. There's just a couple more parting shots I wanted to kind of wrap up your plan of attack now. So what you're going to do is you're going to start with you, write down what you know, work backward in time, generation by generation. You're going to want to stay organized as best as you can so that you don't reinvent the wheel. If you're like me, I can't hang out with my dead people every day. Sometimes a week, 2 weeks, sometimes months will go by before I can get back to that particular person. If you keep your research organized, you can pick right up where you left off, and you won't be going back and reinventing records that you've already located and already scanned. So try to stay organized. And then make sure that you're taking good care of your records and that you're backing up your data on a regular basis. And the last little thing that I want to say, this is kind of my parting shot, and then I'll stop talking and leave it open for questions. Names and dates are important, but there's more than just names and dates. So the lovely lady above that heart is my grandmother. This is on my mother's side now. This is not my dad's wonky family. This is my mother's lovely family. They're a little wonky too, but they're lovely. They're all lovely. And this is her mother. Her mother was born in Argentina, and Maria Ignacia Ramos's father immigrated to Argentina from Spain. My grandmother, the one right here, Mary Shett, she kept her grandfather's birth certificate. Well, it wasn't a birth certificate. He was born in the Catholic Church. It was a birth record. It was a baptism record. She kept her grandfather's baptism record under her dresser glass all the days of her life. When she passed away, my grandfather and my aunt were going through her things. You can see this coming. They had a burn pile and they had a keep pile. And the grandfather's birth record, baptism record, ended up in the burn pile. I didn't think I'd ever find him. There was no information on this man, and it was Spain, and I didn't think I'd ever find him. So families can be elusive. I popped that man's name. I knew his name. That was all I knew. I popped his name once computers came to the fore, in the later years. I popped his name into every search engine that I could find. And all of a sudden one day when I popped that name in, I got a hit. And as it happens, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had gone down to that little parish in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and had microfilmed all of the parish records, all of the baptism, the marriage, and the burial records for that entire parish. I found babies. I found this lovely lady who was my great-grandmother's sister, who immigrated to this country with them. The two girls were the only survivors of what family legend has as a cholera epidemic. I'm finding that may not be true, but it is true that most of the family did not survive to adulthood. Most of the children did not survive to adulthood. So you got to keep at it. Just because you don't find them today doesn't mean that you won't find them tomorrow. Family history is like eating an elephant, and we all know how you eat an elephant, right? You eat them one bite at a time. So keep at it, and I promise you'll be glad that you did. So I'll stop talking now. Any questions?
One more question just came up. What's the farthest back? What year or generation have you gotten in your research?
A lot of people ask that. Well documented, and I mean really well documented, late 1700s. And that's as far as it goes. I know so many people who say, you know, I've traced my line back to Charlemagne, or I've traced my line. No, you didn't. I'm sorry. As a historian, you didn't. The records just don't exist. And when they do exist, they are hopeful representations of what the royal family might have been. But people were, you know, they're all the movies that you see, you know, the movies, people messed around a lot. And whether or not any of those relationships are accurate, oh my gosh, there's just, yeah. So go back as far as your credible sources will allow you. And then don't worry, flesh out the rest of it. It's, you know, it's not a contest to see how far back we get. To me, it's a contest to see how much I can learn about them. I love learning about them. I wouldn't care if I only got back, you know, 100 years, if I could really know them and know what how they lived and what they did, where they were. Yeah. Anything else?
Some great new questions that have come up in the chat.
I thought I was unmuted, sorry. Ray Calloway said, my mother self-published a genealogy of her father's family. Does the Atlanta History Center want a copy of that?
Is there a strong Atlanta connection?
So Ray, maybe follow up
Yes.
with Sue. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, there is.
And that's a good question for anybody in the audience who might be thinking that. Yes, as a matter of fact, that we have a significant number of what we call genealogy subject files. And that's exactly what people will do. They'll do research on their families and they'll donate a copy to the History Center. And then we make those available for researchers. So, yeah.
Okay, yes, he was a mechanic. He worked at Candler Field, and my mom helped him on the planes. And I have, part of that is a record from the newspaper at that time of an article on her helping her father on the planes that were out there
Oh man,
in the
that's
days of
fantastic.
Beeler Blevins and the first folks that were flying out there.
That's fantastic. Excellent.
So she went back all the way into Germany because there were some German relatives that she corresponded with in East Germany and was able to they were able to look up some church records. So
Yeah, that's amazing. Contact me. Absolutely.
okay, thanks.
I have a question.
Go ahead,
Yes.
Frank.
Thank you. First, thanks. Great lecture, and you've really helped because my grandfather on my mother's side was estranged, and I tried to talk to lots of people, and nobody wanted to talk about him other than tell stories. But I have his name and I have a military record, so you gave me some good ideas. But my question is, I'm African American, so for the family members that I can trace back, you get back, you know, my great grandmother was 1867 born. She's the first generation out of slavery. And that happens across a number of pieces where we get their parents who just have first names, they don't have last names, and then you're lost because they were in slavery. Do you have any thoughts about that, or have you had any experience with that?
I do. In the additional resources, there is a link, and boy, I hope there is. John, let me know. Look and let me know if I missed that, but I think there is a link for OGS, which is the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. There is an Atlanta chapter. A past president of that chapter, Emma Davis Hamilton, has done a number of programs here at the History Center. She is my go-to for African-American research. I don't have any African-American ancestry that I have found yet in my background. So she is kind of my go-to person. And if you think of it, if you wouldn't mind sending me an email, let me send you a link to a presentation that she did last year when the pandemic happened on the Freedmen's Bureau records, because you might find that really helpful. And that's recorded and available on YouTube. I can send you that link. But
Great,
you're right.
Thanks. I'll send you an email and you can, yeah, that'd be really great. Thanks so very much.
Right.
But don't give up, because it's hard. It's much harder, because you're going to end up, for those of your ancestors who were enslaved, you're going to end up having to do double research, because you're going to have to research their They're enslavers as well, which is hard. But boy, so much is happening now. There are so many records that are being made available now that there's more hope now than there ever has been for researching your African American ancestry. Yeah.
Thank you.
And Frank, there's a link in one of the handouts to the the Atlanta chapter of the Nationwide African American Historical and Genealogical Society.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Well, thank you so much, Sue. This has been great. We all appreciate it. You've gotten a lot of kudos in the chat, and I'll save that and send it to you so you can smile. Thank you so much. And if there are no other questions, we will say goodbye and look forward to your presentation on Veterans History Project in the fall.
Sue's email address?
It's
Yes.
on the first page of our handout.
Oh, it is. Okay.